Hello. I was just driving home and I've been listening to a lot of Emma Chamberlain's podcasts recently. Like, literally every time I drive home, I listen to one of her podcasts. And I've noticed a lot of, like, the themes that she discusses are to do with kind of, like, similar topics that I discuss. And a thought came to my head, and it was almost like I got the title before I got the content. So I'm not really sure how this is going to go. Also, I'm in my car again. I don't have a mic and cars are coming past frequently. So the audio is going to be terrible. I apologise. But the title of this podcast, which you've probably already seen, but I'm going to tell you this now because I haven't written it yet. Anyway, is why being honest with yourself feels uncomfortable, or why you don't want to be honest with yourself. And I feel like I am very qualified to talk about this because I've gone from two extremes. Sorry, I'm going to have to do the window up because it's actually really not going to work otherwise. I've gone from two extremes. I've gone from being the person that thinks that showing any sign of vulnerability is an indicator of weakness to being very vulnerable and in touch with my emotions, and like being of the mindset that I should just be honest, and if my honesty is not appreciated or it is thrown back in my face, then I did the most that I could do and there was nothing that I didn't say. You know, like, do you ever walk away from a situation or an argument or a conflict or a discussion? It doesn't even have to be negative. And like, you wish you said something and it's like running round and round and round in your head, and you wish you'd said this one sentence or like one statement. I used to be super, super close friends with this girl like years ago. And I remember like our friendship kind of hit the rocks at one point. And this was back when I enjoyed just like running away from people. And I remember I wrote her like this whole big speech out about like how I was feeling. And it was really honest and vulnerable. And like, it was kind of like a first for me to do that, like to be so like honest about how I was feeling and how her actions were making me feel in a way. Like how instead of just being like, I'm fine, and then just running away, because that's kind of what I always did before, because I couldn't just express myself normally. And I remember we went somewhere and I was like prepared to read out like this whole speech, and I just couldn't like bring myself to do it. I just couldn't do it. Like, no part of me could open my mouth and say the words. I don't know why. Just the thought of being honest and almost like critiquing someone and being like, the way that you've been treating me isn't okay, and like setting a boundary and like being like, bitch, what the fuck? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I couldn't do it. And I think this kind of goes back, like, I know I say everything goes back to childhood, but this just does go back to childhood because I never really got like punished as a child because I was a child people pleaser. If you've seen my podcast about gifted child syndrome, you'll know what I'm talking about, where like as a child you're like really smart or really talented in something. Mine was academics, so you don't really get told off because you're just like the good child. But then like anytime that like a slight criticism comes your way, it like shatters your whole self-image. And so anyway, just listen to that podcast. I'm not going to rehash it now, but anyway, yeah, so I didn't really learn to deal with conflict. I didn't grow up in an aggressive household. My mum's like literally never shouted at me once. Like, she's very much like, go sit and think about what you've done, not like shout and scream. So I kind of learned that conflict is very passive and very like, I guess the word autonomous is coming to my mind. Like, it's like a means to an end. It doesn't have to be like this big explosion that I think a lot of other people experience. And this, I think, is the reason why I, in that situation and many other situations throughout my life, couldn't dictate myself the way that I wanted to. So like, I couldn't read out that thing that I'd written down because I was just like, cringe. It's not cringe. It's just like, at the time, like, I didn't have the emotional maturity to be able to speak those words without like wanting the ground to swallow me whole. One, because I think I was worried about what she would think, because I wasn't used to calling people out. Like I said before, I was very much like, if I see traits in someone that I don't like, I will just stop being friends with them and just like leave them. And this is also very not fair, because then people that you think are like your best friends are like, what the fuck are you like, you can't just ditch us. And I'm like, yes, I can. I don't know, it's kind of like a bad one, but also it means that I've never like, I didn't have to deal with that like confrontation or the conversation where you actually like deal with it and you learn from it. And also I think the fact that like, I've always really struggled with communication, if that makes sense. Like, communication is something that, yeah, like, I'm pretty good at it now, but obviously that's through, like, active effort. And I feel like, personally, going through, like, these situations that everyone goes through in their lives, where they have arguments, and then they come out of it the other side, and they whatever, is, like, there's two ways that like you can go about it, I feel, is that you can have the honest conversation and like you can address the root of the issue, which I think is rarer. Or you can do, sorry, I feel like I've just talked about myself for the last like 5 minutes, but I just wanted to give it from like my perspective of the way that I've experienced this growing up, because obviously I know a lot of other people experience it differently, which is what I'll be going into in a second, but I feel like I have the most knowledge about my side of it. I just don't want to come off like self-centered or anything. But anyway, yeah, so you can either be honest and be vulnerable and blah, 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 which is obviously disgusting and gross and everyone hates that. Or you can do either my approach, which is to just run away and not discuss it. Or I think what a lot of other people do is they get defensive. I know quite a few people that are super aggressive in their confrontation, and I mean, I personally see anger as fear, like, dressed up. Kind of like, imagine a porcupine. You know, like, when porcupines are scared, they go spiky. That's just, like, fear masked as anger. Like, the anger is just a way to, like, make it seem like you're not scared. Because, again, being scared is a sign of vulnerability to our brain. And in a confrontation, the last thing that you want is to look vulnerable or to be vulnerable. Not that because that's right, but because that's like scientifically what our brains teach us, is that we have to win at all costs, and looking vulnerable isn't a sign of winning. Now, there's also another side of this, and I had like a dynamic in a friendship that really painted the picture of this sort of like dynamic of the anger and the sadness really well. So I had one person who was like the super angry, and then one that was the super like sympathy, and like, you know those people when you try and confront them about something, or you try and like talk to them about something and they just self-deprecate. They sit there, and do you know, I was having a chat with my mate Joe the other day, and listen to his music on Spotify, by the way, at Hammy. And he was saying, I think he sent me a TikTok or something, and it was basically like, have you ever been in a situation where you've had to call someone out for their behaviour, and they just sit there and do well, I'm the worst person in the world, it would be better if I wasn't here, you obviously hate me, you never want anything to do with me, and then they just cry, and then you end up comforting them because of how they've treated you, because they just feel the worst about it, and they are completely self-deprecating. And I also kind of see this as an avoidance of like conflict, because in my books, I know this is probably just because I've had different socialization to people that have this mindset, but in my books, if you are sitting there and crying and just saying you're the worst person in the world, and that everyone hates you, and that like, no, like, you can't do anything right, even though I've said all of those things, I just want to point out that I've said all of those things before. But when it's like every time that someone's trying to call you out for something you've done, and your default is to just cry and just turn the tears on, it kind of like wears thin really quick. And like, don't get me wrong, if it's like a genuine insecurity, I'm kind of speaking for myself here, like I genuinely have like a real insecurity about like my personality, and like if someone says that I treated them a certain way, like I get real sad about it because I think that I'm like the worst person on the planet. So I empathize with that one completely, but I also will try and find like an active solution to make things better and to not repeat the behavior. I think there's nothing wrong with doing that, but when that's your like default method, and when it's like every time that someone's upset with you, you just bawl your eyes out and you can't take accountability because you just sit there and cry about it, that's not doing anything. Like it's okay to feel like that and to have those emotions and cry and whatever, as long as you actively choose to not do it again. Because there's nothing worse than someone's come to you with an issue, or say you've gone to someone and you're upset about something, you're hurt about something, and you end up comforting them. Like that is the worst feeling. And you also walk of that feeling every time like a mug. Like you just walk out thinking like, what the fuck? Like I've come to you with something that you've done wrong and you've now switched it and made it about you. You know, it's like that power balance in the conversation. And I think like that is another way that people kind of like refuse to be honest with themselves, or kind of deflect, like taking a hard look at themselves, because they just revert back. I kind of feel like everyone in life has like, there's like three, I think there's actually four, like scientifically or like psychologically, it's like fawn and fucking, I don't know, like it's like fight or flight and then like fawn and something else. And I've explained three and I don't know what the other one is, but there's another one. And the fight is like the angry, the flight is what I do, which is run away, the fawn is when they just cry about it. Oh, and then there's freeze, I think, which is where they just, I'm also a bit of freeze, which is where they just don't know what to say, they don't know what to do, they get overwhelmed. I can't really think of anything like explaining that off the top of my head right now, but basically all of these are fucking terrible, and doing all of them is not beneficial for your relationships. However, I do understand that these are literally like ingrained into our brain and we actually don't have control over it. Well, we do have control over it, but like it's like an automatic response that our brain sends us into. So someone with the fawn response who's like, I'm the most terrible person on the planet and everyone hates me and I can't do anything right and you need to comfort me right now because like, yes, it's fucking jarring and it's like really irritating and it's like, please stop doing that and just take accountability. But also that's because of their like past experiences or their predisposition or whatever you believe it to be, nature versus nurture. So I think the thing is with like being honest with yourself and being vulnerable with yourself. I mean, I can say this very easily from the flight side of it, is that I found it, as a person that really struggled with communication, I found it really hard to, sorry, I feel like I'm like running out of voice. Bear with me. Oh, I think I'm gonna, okay, sorry, I thought I was gonna hiccup. Yeah, so I really struggled with, I'm gonna take a sip of my Diet Coke, apologies. Lovely, sorry, I feel better now. Yeah, so I always really struggled to communicate my emotions and my feelings, especially if I was upset with someone. I'd just be like, I'm fine. And I think the thing that helped me the most was actually like writing everything down about how I felt and then like texting it to them. And I know people say that that's really avoidant, but the thing is with like an avoidant attachment style, it's like the baby steps. Like I can now comfortably stand in front of someone and tell them what they've done to hurt me without running away or breaking off a relationship. But that doesn't mean that was like a direct, like I went from one to the other. Like I had to take the baby steps in between to get to where I am today. And it's kind of the same thing. So like for me, other people might think like sending those text messages is like a pussy move or is like a bitch move. But it's, for me, that was a way of me being able to communicate myself when I didn't know how. It was like I still got my feelings across and I still got to set a boundary and I still got to say my bit, but it kind of took the pressure off of like having to watch their reaction and see their face change as I said it to them in person. And also I'm Gen Z, so everything's done over the phone these days. And also, so I think a big step that I would like say to people, if you are struggling with being honest with yourself, is write things down. I think this could go for any of them, especially if you're prone to getting angry or you're prone to just crying. Actually, I would kind of give some different advice for those two. So I don't get super emotional until afterwards. In the moment, I'm very level-headed. So writing things down for me works really well because I'm very, very logical in my thinking, like during a discussion or a disagreement or an argument. Apart from the fact that sometimes my brain's a bit like, bleh, but I would never be like, I hate you, or like, I've never, like, even when I was a teenager, I don't think I ever told my mum I hated her. Like, I'm very not like that. I don't really say things I don't mean, but that's just my personality. And I know that a lot of people really struggle with saying things they don't mean. So I guess if you are like the fawn or the fight types, which are, I guess, like the more highly emotional types of response, it's kind of difficult to speak like outside of my own perspective, but having friends that are in that mindset, I know that what works for them is taking time away from the situation to like diffuse and calm down, because when you're in an emotionally reactive situation and state, your mind and your body is going to go to its default settings. And if that's telling people things that you know are going to hurt them because you feel threatened, you're going to do that. If that means crying like a baby because that's the only way that you know how to get yourself out of a situation that you feel threatened in. Like, think about it. What do babies do when they feel threatened? They cry. It's the same thing. Like, it's literally childhood trauma. It's what we know. It's like the inner child coming out. My inner child was to run away. Theirs is to cry. You know, it's like that kind of different thing. So, and then I don't know what the other one is. What was the other one? Freeze. I'm kind of going to just forget about that one for a minute. That one's irrelevant for right now. So for the emotionally reactive ones, I would really say, like, calm down. And I read somewhere, don't quote me on this, but it takes the body 7 hours to get back to base levels of everything after like an emotional outburst. So whether that's like anger or whether that's crying, it takes your body 7 hours to get back to like its base state, like I guess homeostasis or whatever. Oh my god, did anyone hear that? I'm so sorry, and I can't be bothered to edit this. I'm not sure what that noise was, so apologies. But yeah, I think with those emotional types of personality,
Oh, hey you. Are you in need of a weekly horoscope podcast? Look no further than the Misguided Astrology podcast, tailored to your rising sign. I'm your host, KT, and every week I do a little sky spying, and then I report back with a full horoscope so that you can know just what in the is going on around here. Can I swear on this? The astrology is sound, but my guidance may not be. And that is totally up to you. So subscribe and listen to your Misguided Astrology Rising Sign podcast. Visit our website, misguidedastrology.com, to learn more.
It's really not ideal to have those discussions when you feel those feelings, because either you're going to say something you don't mean, or you're going to, either way, whatever you do, you're not taking responsibility, because when you feel threatened or when you feel sad or when you feel angry, the last thing that you're able to do is take accountability for what you've done, especially if you are in the wrong and it's kind of blatantly obvious that you're in the wrong, but because you're not used to being honest with yourself and taking accountability for your actions, you can't really, like, that's not going to be your first response, is to take accountability or to, like, go, yeah, maybe I was in the wrong. Because think about it, like, our brains are going to do anything in their power to tell us that we are right. They're going to justify their behavior in any way possible, just to make you feel less shitty about what you've done. Because the reality is you probably do already feel a bit shit subconsciously, but you don't want to come to terms with that. You don't want to acknowledge that, because you're already in this worked up emotional state where you're angry or you're sad or you're whatever. You're feeling all these emotions. And when you're feeling all these emotions, kind of like emotions are like, so imagine you've got like the spiritual you, which is like able to look outside of yourself. So the you that is when you meditate and is able to be like, I am the observer and anything that happens to me is a lesson and blah, 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 blah. Emotions are like a big fat curtain that sit on top of spiritual you when they come out, and spiritual you just like goes to bed for a minute and is like, and that's the rational you. And then the irrational you, which kind of relies on like basic instincts and like human nature and like the nitty-gritty of it, you know, that side comes out. The id, if we're looking at like psychology, comes out and it's just like, well, I'm right and you're wrong. Ugh. You know, like that's just the way it is. And that's why if you're like a super emotionally reactive person, it's really important to not speak out of that immature child voice and wait for the like emotional curtain. Sorry, this is a really weird metaphor, but I hope it's making sense. Wait for that emotional curtain to like come down so that you can speak from that higher self again, because when you're speaking from that place of higher awareness and higher acknowledgement, you're able to look outside of yourself and think objectively about the situation. Was there something that I could have done better? And the thing is when you're honest with yourself, and when you, sorry, I can tell this podcast is going to end in a minute. When you're honest with yourself and when you're able to reflect and be like, oh, yeah, I can understand that you would feel that way about that. That's completely valid. Like I can empathize and I can see why you would feel that way about that behavior from me. You can kind of be like, oh, because everyone wins. Like you win because you've taken a step in self-growth and you've been like, I can take accountability for my actions. The person that has addressed the issue with you wins because they feel sorry, me and my friends like joke about like feeling seen and heard, but they like, it's really important. Like that friend then feels seen and heard because you've listened to them. And then it hasn't become this like fight to be right. Like that's one thing that I hate about arguments, is where you always feel like you have to fight to be right. And that is your ego trying to make you win when it's not that. Like, that's not what it should be. And if you can't, like, I think the thing is with being honest with yourself, especially if you're being, like, in the midst of something that is highly reactive and highly emotional, is that threshold becomes, like, a lot higher. It becomes a lot harder to do that. So if you are able to, like, take the time out of that situation and either say, can we come back to this tomorrow when I feel a bit more level-headed? Or, like, upon reflection, I feel like this, or whatever. Even if it takes you a week to go back and be like, look, either I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have done this, or the way I behaved wasn't whatever. That's so much more of a person than someone who has a constant excuse for everything. Because at the end of the day, being honest with yourself isn't nice. It doesn't feel nice to admit that you hurt other people. Like, no one wants to think that they've hurt other people, you know? It's not nice to have those thoughts and those feelings. And it takes a higher caliber of person to be able to deal with that. That it is harder to sit there and acknowledge that you fucked up and take accountability, not because you've been caught, but because of your own back. Like, to sit there and take accountability because you've been caught out doing something is not hard. Like, if you've cheated on someone and you've been caught cheating on someone, and you're like, oh, I feel really bad, and I'm really sorry, and it's like, of course you are, because you've been caught. But taking accountability off of your own back and out of your own time and coming to those conclusions by yourself is a much harder thing to do. And from my perspective anyway, like, gardens a lot more respect, because it is such a hard thing to do. And being sort of that level of honest with yourself, and like being that in touch with yourself to understand that, also being like vulnerable to know that, like, yes, you fucked up and you made a mistake, but coming to that realization means, like, I've had this before with friends in the past, where no matter how many times you try and tell them that what they're doing is upsetting you, they like don't want to hear it, or they'll be like, stop bringing up the same issue. And then when they do it again and you call them out, they're like, why do you keep bringing this up? And it's like, well, because the fact that you're refusing to acknowledge what you've done wrong, you keep repeating this behavior, which is why I keep then bringing it up. And then you keep telling me it's a cycle. And it's like, if you just listened, and if you just were honest with yourself and sort of stepped outside of your own, you know, like, mindset on this and viewed it from another perspective, almost like stepping into someone else's shoes, it wouldn't keep being this recurring issue. And I think, like, this is an issue that a lot of people have. I see this online a lot. A lot of people are like, my boyfriend keeps doing this, or my boyfriend keeps doing that, or not even boyfriend, just like, my friends keep treating me this way, and I've told them that, and then they just like shrug it off, and then it happens again. And it's because until someone is genuinely, truly honest with themselves and takes a step out of their own shoes and into the person that is like coming to them with the issue, and understands and genuinely, like, you know, when you can tell when someone's genuinely taken something on and they're genuinely like have understood where you're coming from, until that happens, there's literally nothing you can do, like, because they're just going to keep repeating the behavior because they haven't fully acknowledged to the extent that it's affecting you. And I also do think that there will be times where, no matter how vulnerable you are, no matter how honest you are, when you go to someone and say, look, I feel this way, or whatever, you're not always going to win, you know? And I say win in the sense of, like, get what you want out of the situation. You're not always going to find the answers that you need, or you're not always going to get that comfort or the consolidation. And it is okay to give up sometimes. Like, giving up sometimes is necessary, you know? Like, I was going to try and think of some, like, metaphor about some person who's famous who did one thing and then quit and did another thing, but I couldn't think of one. But I don't know, like, there's a lot of people that probably did a job and thought they were going to be good at the job, but the job wasn't going anywhere, and then they did another job and they realized that that was actually a really good thing for them, and then it became their career, you know? So think about it like that, is that if your friends or your boyfriend or your parents or whatever is really treating you like shit, no matter how hard you try, they're still not listening, just sack them off. It's okay to do that at the end of the day. I think as long as you've tried and you know that you've been honest and that you've been genuine in how you feel, that's the hardest bit. If you can do that, you can do anything, my ladies and gentlemen. And I don't know what the gender neutral term for that is. I apologise. But love you guys. Thank you for listening. See you later.